President Trump is turning up the pressure on NATO with repeated threats to walk away from the alliance. But what would the true cost of that be to the United States if they really did withdraw?
I've served alongside NATO forces in Afghanistan and Kosovo, so I've got a good idea of just how important US leadership is. But I also know what the US gains from the surveillance of Russian submarines to the rapid deployment of US forces from European bases. America doesn't just lead NATO, it needs it.
And if Washington does walk, then what fills that vacuum? Could NATO survive a US exit? And could it expand in a different direction, bringing in Ukraine from the cold? The answers may surprise you. Stay with us. This is the Security Brief. Mikey, I think we should start with a scene setter. Remind us which countries are part of the NATO alliance.
Yeah, so NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed in 1949, initially with a North Atlantic Western bloc of 12 countries, which grew post-war into what we see today, which is today's alliance of 32 countries. Let's just take a look at a map, and you can see just on this map how congested, if you like, the NATO countries are over in Europe. But over on the left of the screen, Canada, United States of America. You can see the vastness of Canada on that map, actually. And then that conglomerate of countries making up the 32.
And it's important, especially in the current context, to remember that this alliance was formed for the collective defense of Europe from the perceived threat of Soviet expansion.
In one sense, the treaty was as much about keeping the US in the alliance as it was about keeping the Russians out of Europe. But of course, the US do have a vested interest. You know, we've got to keep remembering to going back and looking what has happened in history. And basically, the US vested interest was preventing a repeat of World War II.
We should say the overwhelming contribution to that alliance, both militarily and financially, is from the United States. But wouldn't they spend that money whether or not they were members of NATO?
The big benefit that the US gets, or one of the huge benefits that the US gets, is the ability to what's called power project in its current form. And they would lose that cost benefit if they were to leave the alliance.
Can you give me an example of that?
I can. The US relies critically on intelligence that comes from the Nordic countries. And that intelligence pertains to the movement of Russian submarines coming out of Murmansk. Russia's nuclear deterrent when it comes to the submarine. Those submarines are based at Godzievo naval base, which is near Murmansk. Now, when those submarines come up the estuary, the Nordic countries have intelligence that tracks those submarines, because those submarines won't be submersed at that point. They'll go deep once they get into deep waters, into the high seas. And this is really critical because the nuclear missiles on those submarines, they're not pointed at Oslo, they're not pointed at Stockholm, they're not pointed at Helsinki. They're pointed at LA, they're pointed at Miami, they're pointed at DC, they're pointed at New York. And I think that's one of the most compelling reasons in terms of intelligence that I've heard in a long time.
Were the US to withdraw, then of course the rest of the alliance would lose what they bring to NATO as well.
And you know, there's no covering this up, there's no masking it. It would be an enormous loss to the alliance. And Europe realised that, I think we realised that. So what is that? So we're talking about most of the nuclear deterrent. We're talking about strategic airlift and air refueling, you know, something that you would think, you know, is quite benign when it comes to warfare. Absolutely critical to conduct the type of operations that we've seen over Iran. The Europeans couldn't provide that air refueling capability during the war in Libya, so it is what we call a critical vulnerability. They would lose the intelligence, which is huge, ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, and crucially the Space Force that provides a lot of that intelligence on GEOINT, for example, geointelligence. Global strike and bomber capabilities. You know, we've seen the B-2s, you know, dropping huge bombs over Iran, the B-1s and the B-52s based out of Fairford. Europe doesn't have a strategic bomber capability like that. And then actually going back to sort of the command structure, I think that's another key point that we don't focus on too often. So the US does have a lot of leverage over other members of the alliance, but I want to come back to the strategic interests the US has in this alliance, because the best argument, I think, and we were speaking about this, for remaining comes from analysis of what the US gains from the current status quo. And the best way to see that, I think, is initially we should kind of look at the map, or we will look at the map and the bases to which the US currently have access. So let's start with Canada. 4 bases. This is the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD as it's commonly known. And it's an air defense network deeply integrated across the US Canadian Arctic. It's got 3 core missions: aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning. And it's got 4 bases that we can see on the map here. You've got 2 in the west, 1 central, and 1 out in the east. And why they're critical is that you can deploy US fast jets to those, and the purpose of that would be to intercept ballistic missiles coming from the east.
And on the edge of that map, I can see Greenland, part of the Kingdom of Denmark, of course, crucially important to that defence posture you're outlining there. In fact, so important, Donald Trump thinks it should be part of US sovereign territory.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of posturing on that. The key base there is called Pituffik Space Base in Greenland, and you can see Pituffik literally just high up on the western side of the Greenland ice shelf. Why that's important is it's US operated, and it's important to say that it's not US sovereign territory. And it has such importance because the shortest routes between North America and Russia is over that territory through the Arctic. So Pituffik Space Base provides missile warning, space tracking, and Arctic surveillance, which are key.
Let's come further east to Iceland.
Yeah, we've got Keflavik Air Base there. This is key because effectively the base gives NATO eyes onto what's called the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. And this plays a critical role in the monitoring of Russian submarine activity and the air traffic between the Arctic and the Atlantic. And sometimes we can see Russian strategic bombers, Russian intelligence aircraft coming all the way over the Nordics and sort of probing those areas.
And under what basis does the US have access to Keflavik and the bases in Greenland?
Yeah, I mean, they're memorandums of understanding. They operate these facilities under treaty agreements, either through an agreement with the host country or under mutual defense agreements that come with NATO membership. Again, important point to note, this is not US territory.
Right, which brings us to the UK and to Europe. What locations does the US rely on here?
Yeah, let's start with the UK. Let's start with the map. Now, viewers may have seen or are very familiar with these names based off Operation Epic Fury. Let's start with RAF Lakenheath. These bases give the US an ability to power project predominantly across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Russian Federation, or at least to deter. And in the most recent example, these bases have been key to operations, as I say, not just on Operation Epic Fury, but also on Operation Midnight Hammer last year. It's home to the US's 48th Fighter Wing. It's the largest fighter wing in Europe, and it operates 4 combat-ready squadrons, the F-15 Strike Eagle, which you can see in the top of the picture there, and the F-35 5th-generation stealth fighter.
And to the point, because the US is a NATO member, it can rely, in normal circumstances, on other bases here in the UK that it would have access to under treaty agreements.
Yeah, and I think RAF Fairford down in Gloucestershire, I mean, that's a good example of that. Let's just take a look at where RAF Fairford is. These US assets here at Fairford, and we're talking about the B-1B Lancer and the B-52, the strategic bombers that we were talking about. They are not permanently based here. They are forward deployed. And the criticality of this operating base is huge because we've seen so much activity of B-1s getting airborne out of Fairford to conduct missions on Iran. And the B-52 strategic bombers as well, they're carrying precision-guided cruise missiles.
Right, okay, let's move into Europe. Most of our viewers will know that for many years now, Ramstein Air Base in Germany has been the centre of gravity, really, for US operations around the world.
It's down in the southwest of Germany. I think we can take a look at a map just to show the viewers where it is. And it serves as the headquarters for US Air Forces in Europe, USAF, and NATO Allied Air Command. And crucially, there are also some medical facilities there for medevac, medical evacuation as we call it, specifically for US soldiers injured in combat. And it was particularly critical for US operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And also located at Ramstein is some of the most important communications, intelligence, and C2 command and control network. So it really is a hybrid of capability out there, but predominantly based sort of in the headquarters air command
okay.
space.
Who pays for the US bases in Germany? Because Trump likes to tell us that they pick up the bill for this.
Well, look, it's quite obviously the US do pick up a fair chunk of that bill. And we'll come back to more spending in a bit. But I think it's also important to note that the Germans pay for the infrastructure. They pay for the land, the utilities, any locally employed contractors the Germans will pick up the tab for. And the numbers we're looking at really, I think Germany has spent over $1 billion over the last 10 years supporting US bases in Germany.
President Trump is threatening to draw down US troop numbers in Germany. In fact, he announced on social media not many weeks ago that 5,000 troops were heading to Poland. Do we have any clarity on whether that is a straight redeployment from Germany?
I think the word is ambiguity. There's actually a lot of ambiguity of what the US operational plan is, if you like. And I know that because I've spoken to a number of senior commanders inside NATO who just don't have the fidelity on what's going on with that. And there's real confusion over the deployments. If you look at the map of the United States, we can look at a graphic here of permanent US troops in Europe. You can see that right across the map, and in the biggest countries such as the UK, Germany, and Italy, they've got a real significant presence. The countries in red tell us that there are well over 5,000 troops each. Although, again, it's well worth saying that when you look at trends since 1955, we are well down on where we were at the height of the Cold War. I think we've got a nice little graph that shows the decline of permanent US troops. And just to cover that briefly, you can see in 1955 it was over 400,000. Then you can see in 1989 you can see a huge decline back down to 100,000.
End of the Cold War.
End of the Cold War, exactly. And then out to today, you've got just under 66,000. So I think that's quite a poignant graph in terms of where we're trending.
There's a focus too on the command structure in Brussels, because it's always been the case that a US 4-star general, admiral, has commanded NATO forces in Europe. Do you think that is likely to change?
Yeah, ever since NATO's inception in 1949, the senior man called SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, has been a US 4-star general or an admiral. But I have spoken to sources in the past week in the run-up to the big NATO summit in Ankara that we're going to at the beginning of July, who told me that one of their biggest worries, if you like, or one of their biggest objectives is to maintain that 4-star US leadership across the entire command structure of NATO in Europe. And I think...
Because they would view that as keeping the Americans plugged in.
Exactly, keeping them engaged. I think it's all about that. And the decade thing's interesting because, I think that's non-US NATO commanders signaling that they're going to need about 10 years.
That's the horizon that they see.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Since you mentioned Ankara, we should just quickly touch on Turkey, because they're a crucial part of the NATO framework, and a base that you've spent some time on.
Yeah, a little bit en route Afghanistan. Let's just take a look at the map. The base that you're talking about is Incirlik, which you can just see on the right of the shot. Just briefly looking at the other two, Lajes Air Base, that was critical for forward deployments. It's Portuguese owned, but US aircraft are looking at that for forward deploying into the Middle East. And the Naval Air Station at Sigonella, that's the home of the headquarters for the US Navy's 6th Fleet, which are critical for operations in the Mediterranean, North Africa and the Middle East. But yeah, going back to Incirlik Air Base, I have spent some time there en route to Afghanistan. The Turks have the largest standing army in NATO outside of the US, more than 350,000 active troops on almost 400,000 reservists, which is huge if you look at it compared to UK standards. But more important to that is it gives the US and it gives NATO a huge presence on NATO's southeastern flank, and it continues to be a critical logistics hub for US operations against Islamic State in Syria, for example. And the over-horizon approach to Afghanistan. We think that's gone away, but it hasn't. And of course, the ongoing war in Iran. You might not also know that Incirlik is also reportedly home to US tactical nuclear weapons. So it's a pretty sensitive location, to say the very least.
At the risk of going around the map, although I think actually for our viewers, going around the map does sort of signal just how difficult it would be to unpick all of this.
Yeah, huge.
But I do want to just quickly touch on Diego Garcia, because again, it further underlines for me just how reliant US operations are on the treaty agreements they have.
Yeah, so UK have a base on Diego Garcia. Let's just take a look where Diego Garcia is on the map out there in the Indian Ocean. And it's why Donald Trump became so involved in the proposed deal to hand the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. There was reporting last week that Trump is considering the purchase of the Chagos Islands to bypass the UK. And that is because it's so massively valuable to the US. You can see on the screen here, they are 4 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers that drop the bomb like the massive ordnance penetrator. That's the only capability that can get anywhere close to destroying underground facilities, nuclear facilities in Iran.
Okay, so that is the map. That's the distribution of the most important US military assets around the NATO countries. But what about the industrial aspect to this? Because the benefit the US economy draws from the defense sector and Europe's procurement of US made arms is a critical piece of this.
Yeah, it's what I would regard as a central tenet to the debate for both sides. So Italy, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, they all spend less than 10% of their defense budgets on imports. But, and this is the key bit, they still lack the high-end military technology, software, satellites, mid-air refueling aircraft, and advanced fighter jets like the F-35, which are indispensable to high-tech modern warfare, if indeed that is the threat.
Can we touch on the disparity of spending? Because that's another part of the debate we'll be having in Ankara, what the Europeans spend vis-a-vis the United States.
Yeah, and this comes back to what Donald Trump wants, which is he wants to increase the GDP on defense of NATO countries out to 5%. 3.5% would be core defense capability. The other 1.5 would be the defense industrial base, infrastructure, cyber. And this is, for cash-strapped European countries, that is a significant task. It's going to take decades. And why that's important is because the longer it takes for European NATO countries to get to that 3.5%, the longer the delay on generating their own organic capability to be able to plug those gaps that we've been talking about, like ISR.
Right. Okay, some final thoughts. Let's quickly explore the worst case scenario that Trump follows through on the threat, somehow gets Congress to agree to withdraw, and they pull out entirely or in part. What does the rump of the NATO alliance then look like?
So I think this is where the numbers really come into play. The economic output of the GDP of NATO countries without the US is around 27 trillion per year. US GDP is around $30 trillion. From that, the US proposes to spend on defense 1.5 trillion in 2027. That's been requested. So that would be around 5% of GDP. Now that's not all on NATO, it's important to say that. That is the US 5% of GDP spending on its own core defense capabilities. But if you then look at what NATO countries without the US spend, it's around 574 billion. Which is around an average across all countries of about 2.2%.
Okay, so that would be a difference of spending of 1 trillion a year, which is significant.
Between the US and the UK.
Right. But still...
NATO countries.
But still defense spending in NATO minus the United States is, you say, 574 billion. How does that compare to what Russia spends?
Well, this is the question. So, again, Europe are focusing... NATO countries in Europe are looking at the US and going, wow, $1.5 trillion. But if you look east and see what Russia's spending per year on defense, it's 190 billion. Or it was 190 billion in 2025. It's around 7.5% of
while they're at war.
Russia's GDP. And it's increased, obviously, because of that since 2022. So at current spending levels, NATO minus the US would be spending 3 times what Russia is spending on its defense.
So why are Russia spending a third of what the rest of NATO spends and yet seemingly exist as a bigger threat to Europe than we are to them?
Yeah, so Europe is making real progress in strengthening its defense industrial base. That trend is like a hockey stick. It's getting better. But the long pole in the tent is getting to that 3.5%. And that's what NATO commanders are concerned about. Because without that 3.5%, you can't start bolstering counter threats to what you see from the likes of Russia. And what's really important here is what I want to focus on is what I'm calling the non-nuclear deterrent. And that is the threat from Russia at the moment is 6,500 one-way attack drones into Europe. That's what it's currently putting into Ukraine. It's what it put into Ukraine in April. Europe currently has little to no counter-drone capability that could deal with that size of threat, which is why, looking towards Ukraine, a battle-hardened Ukraine is absolutely critical to the European defence structure, looking over the horizon, over that 10 years, as we were talking about. We can say for another programme how NATO might evolve without the US and what treaty negotiations would be required. But ultimately, Christian, it's hugely complicated. But it would stand to reason that were the US to withdraw, either in the main or in part, I think Europeans would move very quickly to bring Ukraine into the fold in what treaty or alliance that might become. And yes, NATO countries are looking towards the implications of a US departure. But I think given what Ukraine's doing now, there's a huge positive to looking east and maybe an alliance with Ukraine.
Mikey, some really fascinating insight as ever, and it sets us up nicely, I think, for the NATO summit that the two of us will be attending in July. Incidentally, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, says Donald Trump will be attending, but whether he's there or not, I think the debate will touch on many of the things we've just covered, and I think that analysis will stand us in good stead. Just a reminder, if you want to look at previous episodes of the Security Brief, it's all there on the BBC YouTube website. I'm putting the QR code on screen for you so you can go to that should you wish. And remember, you can send us your thoughts and questions on email, security.brief at bbc.co.uk. Do send us those questions and we'll get to some of those in a future episode. That's it for this one. We'll see you next time.